From Chatham House, this is the International Affairs podcast. IA is published 6 times a year in association with Wiley Blackwell. This month sees International Affairs celebrate its 90th anniversary, and in this very special edition, I speak with the editor of the journal, Caroline Soper, about the shifts in international affairs throughout its 90-year lifespan.
Well, I've been very keen to maintain the academic approach to the journal. I think that's very important, but at the same time, making sure that it is policy relevant and accessible. So academics talking to policymakers.
Plus, I talk with David Stevenson, who examines the study of international history and its relevance today.
So these two ideas of a think tank and a teaching operation came together in the 20s. Chatham House at one side of the equation and the London School of Economics at the other.
And I chat to Paul Rodgers, who looks at the century from 1945 to 2045 and how it is likely to prove seminal in terms of human progress.
I think in a curious way we're in a prophetic era. My definition of prophecy is suggesting the possible. We have huge problems worldwide coming up at us. The combination of a constrained world which has very deep socio-economic divisions. I think we're in an era where we have to have some really good new thinking implemented pretty quickly to try and make us avoid what could be a very dangerous and unstable world.
So I'm here at Chatham House with Caroline Soper, who is the editor of International Affairs. Thanks for speaking to us, Caroline. So this is the 90th volume of the journal. What do you think has given it such longevity?
Well, I think it is probably the link with Chatham House that has given it that sense of independence and unbiased research. And the reputation, I think, of Chatham House has steadily grown since its inception in 1920. Readers have the confidence, I think, that they can trust the judgment of Chatham House and hence, I hope, of international affairs. And it's interesting that the first editor, Gathorne Hardy, said in his little introduction to the journal in 1922 that the journal of which this is the first issue will, it is hoped, become a source of information and a guide to judgment in international affairs. And I think that's what we try to do, and I hope we've been successful in it.
Would you like to just take us through the evolution of international affairs from its inception in the 1920s up to the journal that we see today?
It's evolved tremendously because from about 1922 to the 1960s, it was really dealing with reports and speeches from Chatham House itself. In the 60s, it began to take its own articles from outside authors. Of course, the 1950s were mainly concerned with communism and the Cold War, and the 60s with decolonisation and the Vietnam War, of course. And then in the 70s, there was the whole question of Europe. The 80s looked at Iran and Afghanistan and the Falklands and the nuclear weapons issue. And I just would like to say here that the nuclear weapons issue has been a leitmotif through the journal since the war. And that's been an important issue that we keep going back to. In the 1990s, we had the 75th anniversary of Chatham House. In the 90s, of course, the journal was looking specifically at the end of the Cold War. And then into the 2000s, we discussed the changing nature of world order post 9/11, and focusing also on so-called sort of new issues such as biodiversity, HIV/AIDS, climate change, all those kind of things.
In your time here, what do you feel has been your own personal stamp that you've put on international affairs?
Well, I've been very keen to maintain the academic approach to the journal. I think that's very important, but at the same time, making sure that it is policy relevant and accessible. So academics talking to policymakers is one of our mantras, if you like. Also holding on to the international history aspect of international relations, making sure that those issues like nuclear weapons, Africa, and IR, international relations theory, the English school, are well represented. And of course the journal has to be content-led and not author-led. That's extremely important.
In this, the 90th volume of International Affairs, what are your hopes for the next 90 volumes?
Well, I hope the journal continues. It may continue in a very different format, but I hope that it will be a guide to judgment that the first editor hoped it would be, and I hope that will be the case, and that it'll carry on, it'll change, it'll develop, and it'll seek out new ways of informing the readership.
I've come to the London School of Economics to interview David Stevenson, who's Professor of International History at LSE, and whose article is entitled Learning from the Past, the Relevance of International History. Professor Stevenson, this article is based on the inaugural lecture for the Stevenson Chair in International History, which you gave at the LSE in October 2012. In it, you look at the close ties between the London School of Economics teaching of international history and the beginnings of Chatham House.
The Stevenson Chair of International History was established in the 1920s. The money was made available through an endowment from a Glasgow businessman, Sir Daniel Stevenson. And Sir Daniel Stevenson's concept was for something that would link the teaching of international history with research into modern international relations. Very much the underlying concept behind this, the concern, was to learn the lessons from the outbreak of the First World War, which he and many people of his generation viewed as an absolute disaster. But he was looking particularly to the idea of trying to purge nationalist bias from the teaching of history. And that concern of his matched up quite well with the thinking of Lionel Curtis, who was the driving spirit behind the formation of Chatham House. What Curtis was trying to do was to establish a think tank, as we would now call it, where practitioners and intellectuals and academics could come together to exchange ideas about international opinions and also help to inform public opinion. And they were looking in particular for someone who could write an annual survey of international affairs. Stevenson was willing to provide the money for the survey on the condition that it was linked with a teaching project, and the teaching project was to be delivered through the University of London, and particularly through the London School of Economics as a college of the university. So these two ideas of a think tank and a teaching operation came together in the 20s. Chatham House at one side of the equation and the London School of Economics at the other.
And what specifically happened in the 1920s that led for a need to, or a feeling that teaching of international history was really necessary?
The big thing that happened in the 1920s was that all of the major powers that had been involved in the First World War started to publish big collections of diplomatic documents, thousands of documents being made available in the public domain. So the consequence of all of this was an explosion of information. Documents that normally would not have become available for decades were put into the public domain barely 10 years after the events that the documents related to. This was something that was quite new, and it created an enormous opportunity for international historians to get to work on that raw material.
You look at the interconnection between the diplomatic crises of July and August 1914 and October 1962, and John F. Kennedy's use of history to inform statesmanship.
This is one of the most famous examples that's always produced in the literature, that Kennedy said himself at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that he'd just recently read Barbara Tuchman's book called The Guns of August, which is a study of the outbreak of war in 1914. And he attached such importance to this that all American overseas military bases were expected to receive a copy of this book and were asked to read it. So it's not just the president himself, he's giving a direction to the whole of his administration. And the argument in that book very much was that the outbreak of the First World War was an avoidable disaster, that it was caused by miscalculation and misunderstanding, and by statesmen and politicians finding that their military planning got out of control.
And do you think history is still informing political thinking and policy making today?
In some ways it's become more relevant than it was 10 or 15 years ago. I quote Tony Blair speaking to the American Congress in 2003 at the time of the run-up to the Iraq War, saying there that the study of history actually is now less relevant than at any previous time in living memory. And perhaps at that point of time, in the context was the recent assault on the Twin Towers, the beginning of the war against terror, it looked as if international politics was taking a very different kind of direction from the interstate rivalry and danger of war, diplomatic crisis and so on that we see in the 19th century, in the 1930s or during the Cold War. It looks as if we're moving to a new situation with non-state actors becoming very important and all the old boundaries are becoming fluid. And what we're seem to be seeing is we're moving into a position where it's much more recognisable from the past of interstate conflict, if you like, between rising powers on the one hand, China in particular, declining powers on the other hand, the United States, bears a number of comparisons with that situation in Europe before 1914, even if there are also very important differences.
It's 90 years since the partnership between the London School of Economics and Chatham House began. In that time, what do you think is the biggest shift in the landscape of international affairs?
The big change is that the scope of the subject has enormously broadened. Now, again, in the article, I try to show that there were differing views right from the beginning about what was the proper subject matter and scope of international history. There's a kind of professional school, if you like, more conservative interpretation, which said it should really focus on diplomacy and interstate relations. There was a broader school, and the best representative of this is Arnold Toynbee, who was the first holder of the Stevenson chair, who argued right from the beginning that that's not good enough, that you also need to understand the kind of intellectual currents of opinion at the time, you need to understand economic and strategic factors, and in other words, to situate international political relations in their context, or you can't understand them. And the big change that's happened in the discipline, particularly since the 1990s actually, there's been a major shift in the direction almost away from traditional diplomatic history to looking particularly at cultural factors, intellectual factors, what's called now transnational history, which is looking at the relations between different non-state organisations. And all of this is important, but I think what I try to argue in the article, you mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You do still need to understand intergovernment relations too, because governments in the end control the means of violence, or particularly the most dangerous means of violence, and they make the crucial decisions, even if you can't understand those decisions really, unless you fit them into the overall social and intellectual context within which the governments operate.
I'm delighted to be here now with Professor Paul Rodgers, who's come to Chatham House to have a conversation with me about his article, A Century on the Edge, From Cold War to Hot World, 1945 to 2045. Would you like to explain why you think this century will be particularly significant to human history?
What I thought I'd do is take a century which most people wouldn't recognise as being significant and argue that it's actually hugely important in long-term human history. The argument is that during this 100-year period, 1945 to 2045, we as a developing human community have to face two problems of our own making. One is our ability to use weapons of mass destruction and cause massive damage, not to exterminate everything, but certainly set civilization back maybe 100 or more years and cause huge environmental damage. That was really why 1945 is key. You're coming in with the development of nuclear weapons, chemical and other weapons as well, but the nuclear ones are huge. And that really is something we have to come to terms with. And the article argues that we've done it in a way, but it's been more by luck than judgment or wisdom. And we're not out of the woods as far as the nuclear threat is concerned. And then the second problem we face, which is coming almost in the second part of this century, is our ability to cause huge environmental damage. It's really a variant of the limits to growth, but it points in particular to what is now recognised as a hugely important risk, and that's the growth of what I would call climate disruption rather than climate change. So in a nutshell, in this century, we have to come to terms with our capacity to destroy ourselves and our capacity to cause huge problems for the global environment. If we can do that, then I think the latter part of the 21st century really could be quite hopeful. If we can't, then I think we're in for a very rough time in security terms.
You also argue that far from nuclear weapons keeping the peace, they have actually contributed to several wars by proxy.
The common phrase is nuclear weapons kept the peace. I would argue strongly against that on two bases. One, as you say, there were many proxy wars fought under the shadow of the Cold War. Everything from Nicaragua and El Salvador in Latin America through to Angola, the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, and many, many others. And if you look at that, although none of those wars ever went hot in terms of the global thing, they were proxy between East and West. And about 10 million people were killed and maybe 20 to 30 million people seriously injured. Many people maimed for life, economies wrecked for generations. The nuclear era was, I think, far more dangerous than people realise. There are new generations of scholars and students coming through who have no idea of how incredibly devastating nuclear weapons were at the height of the Cold War. And I think we were lucky to avoid something like a catastrophe.
You also look from the Cold War to post 9/11 and the War on Terror, and you discuss why you think lessons have still not been learnt.
You know, the United States' view was it had slain the dragon, but now inhabited a jungle full of poisonous snakes, and had to protect itself against myriad of smaller threats. And you do that by war light. You don't have huge forces overseas. And that was the attitude used both to terminate the Taliban regime in late 2001 and to terminate the Saddam Hussein regime in 2003. Neither worked as intended, and we ended up with hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground and long-lasting wars with, as of now, Iraq in some degree of chaos, and in Afghanistan the war continues. So we haven't really learnt to get over this idea of control through what I call lidism, keeping the lid on things rather than going for the underlying problems.
Are you optimistic for the latter part of the century you describe?
And I'm actually quite optimistic. And let me say why. I mean, the first thing is that in overall terms, the world, person for person, our personal experience of violence is probably lower than at any time in human history. So I think you have to look at it that way. And there's some evidence that, you know, the current decade, the 2010s, is actually less violent than the 1990s. So there's prospects. The other thing is I think we've luckily come out of the Cold War. The risk of nuclear confrontation is there. There's a risk of proliferation. It's not at the level of 30 years ago. So there's that. And also there's a lot of very good new thinking going on. You know, people are trying to think through what we need to do. And that could be everything from all different kinds of ways of living within our means, work on a whole range of alternative technologies. I have my own pet definition of prophecy. I call prophecy suggesting the possible. And I think, in a sense, we're in a prophetic age. We need the work to demonstrate why we need to make the changes and why we can't just control things as in the past. And there's some very significant canaries around in terms of canaries in the coal mine, warnings. And one of the ones is extreme weather. I mean, it's undoubtedly true there is more extreme weather than 20, 30, 40 years ago. And also the climate itself is changing. It's a marker for what will come. And the real issue is whether we can actually observe that marker and act accordingly.
Thank you.